Y'all looked especially Pentecostal just a little while ago. I kind of liked the look of it. Maybe on the last hymn. You think we could do this on the last hymn? Maybe wait. It was nice. You know, I remember very well, and some of you might remember it as well, the old magnolia tree in the Duke Gardens. Years ago when we lived in Durham for the first time, sometimes we would go to the Duke Gardens on a Saturday or go after church on Sunday, and this magnolia tree with those really low, strong, big branches was irresistible for youngsters to climb. Every time we were there, the tree was teeming with kids pretending to be monkeys. I also remember when the tree got roped off. And it had a sign put on it that said, "Don't climb the tree." And the sign explained that years of kids climbing the tree had damaged the bark and was killing the tree. But it wasn't just climbing the tree that was killing the tree. According to the garden superintendent, it was also simply years and years of people walking around the base of the tree, compressing the soil, and it was killing the roots. So 10 years ago, this 63-year-old magnolia tree died and was cut down. Jesus tells a story of a man who owned a vineyard. And he'd planted a fig tree in his vineyard, and the fig tree did not bear any fruit. Year after year, he looked so forward to picking a ripe fig, or to fig preserves, or to canned figs, or to fig pie, or to fig jelly, or whatever you can do with figs. He looked forward to it, and year after year, he came and the tree was barren. So, tiring of this annual disappointment, he says to the gardener, "Look, just cut the thing down. I'm done with it." But the gardener proposes patience. The gardener says, "Give it a chance. Give me a chance with it." And then what the gardener does to the tree suggests what might have actually been wrong with the tree. The first thing he does before he puts fertilizer on the tree is to dig around the roots, loosening the soil. And it makes you think this fig tree might have had the same problem as the old magnolia tree. I recently read an article called "The 10 Easiest Ways to Kill a Tree and How to Avoid Them." And reason number 8 was compact the soil. The article said that soil around the roots should be 50% porous, so that there's space for the soil to hold water and oxygen for the roots. And so it makes sense, because when the soil is compacted, the roots will quite literally suffocate. So before he did anything else, watered the roots or put fertilizer around the tree, the gardener loosened the soil to create some space, because suffocated roots can't nourish a tree. Now, can you picture this barren fig tree, or maybe that old dying magnolia with its big brown, crispy, dead leaves? If we can, we might have a picture in our minds of lives that we know, right? Meaningless, purposeless, seemingly lifeless, barren, self-contained and self-centered, and all because the roots of that life, what we might call the soul or the heart or the deepest part of that life, all because it's cut off, because it's pressed and suffocated and cut off from the source of its life. It's not hard, is it, for us to imagine that kind of life? So if Jesus is giving us a picture, if this fig tree is a picture of human lives that we might know, or maybe of our lives at one time, or of our lives now, or of what we're afraid our lives might become, if this is a picture of a possibility for human life, then isn't it critical that we ask the question, what is it that can suffocate our roots? What is it that can press down and compact the roots of our lives and cut us off from the source of life? I know I've told you about the Quaker Thomas Kelly before, but I'm going to unapologetically tell you about him again. Because when I think of suffocated roots, his life is the first one that comes to my mind. Kelly was born a Quaker in 1893, and it didn't take long for him to grow up and for it to be discovered that he was quite smart and quite driven. And it became clear to him that he was going to find his identity in life through academic achievement, not unlike the kind of people you might run into around Duke. Well, he went to seminary at Hartford Seminary and then taught for a while and then went back to Hartford Seminary and got a PhD in philosophy and went to a little college in the Midwest to teach, but that wasn't enough. Because after all, who's ever heard of Hartford Seminary? And who's ever heard of this little college in the Midwest? Kelly hadn't arrived. He wasn't adequate yet. And so he decided he would get another PhD, except this time he would get it from Harvard, because everyone knows where Harvard is and what Harvard is. So working on his second PhD in philosophy, it came time for him to defend his dissertation when his Harvard professors learned that he already had a PhD in the same field. And they decided this wasn't appropriate, so they weren't going to let him come and defend his dissertation. And he fell into a deep depression and went back to teaching. But he persevered and he was relentless, and eventually Harvard changed their mind. And so when Kelly came to the oral defense of his dissertation, that moment in his life when he was going to prove himself, he had some kind of mental or psychological breakdown. He forgot everything. He forgot his name. He forgot where he was. He forgot anything he'd ever learned about philosophy, and he was devastated. Harvard said, "We've had enough of you. You're never trying this again." And Kelly was absolutely humiliated. He was robbed of that very thing that was going to be his identity, an academic man, a Harvard man. And he fell into a very deep depression and became nearly suicidal. Ambition. That search for significance through achievement. It had cut Kelly off from that source of life and made it so he almost didn't survive. It reminds me of the Duke professor who gave a speech at my hooding ceremony when I finished graduate school. He gave the speech as a warning to us when he said that 2 years earlier he had achieved what he called the academic trifecta. In the same year he got tenure, got divorced, and had a heart attack. The academic trifecta. And I suspect that he might have recognized himself in this barren, suffocated fig tree. When our souls are pressed by ambition, we can find ourselves in this fig tree. Or when our lives are burdened with bitterness, we can recognize ourselves in this fig tree. Or when our lives are pressed by unforgiving hearts, we can recognize ourselves in this fig tree. Or when our lives are suffocated by anxiety and fear of others, we can find ourselves in this barren fig tree. Or when our lives are pressed by possessions, we can recognize ourselves in this barren fig tree. Maybe some of you have read the inspiring book called The Power of Half. It's a book written by Kevin Sowlin, and he tells the story about how his family discovered the power of extraordinary generosity to transform their family life. They were inspired by their teenage daughter, who had been volunteering at a homeless shelter. And she became convicted about the difference between those who have and those who have not. And after some time and conversation with her family, the family decided that they would sell their $2 million home in Atlanta and give half of the money to countries in Africa to support sustainable agriculture. That's the transformation. But on the way to that story, Samhain has a chapter called The Treadmill. And it's in that chapter where he tells how this almost imperceptibly increasing drive to accumulate threw their whole family out of whack, even when they acquired this $2 million home and thought they had arrived. Here's what he says about their life. He says, it would have been difficult to differentiate us from other families. 2 parents, 2 kids, nice house dog. We worked hard, we got promotions, we came home. Shopping for stuff expanded beyond buying what Joan and I desired to include what the kids needed, creating plenty of new opportunities for accumulation. Like others we knew, we bought most things we wanted. Don't get me wrong, he says, money is not a bad thing, but spend becomes a brutal way to raise kids. They start to believe that everything is replaceable, or that everything costs the same amount. An ever-escalating standard of living becomes the new normal. And for them, this new normal had a high price tag. He says, as a family, we were losing our core. Our family was spinning into different galaxies. Now, a family doesn't lose its core overnight, any more than the roots of that magnolia tree were killed overnight. But our souls, our lives can be slowly suffocated by bitterness, anger, envy, jealousy, greed, possession. Slowly, the very core of our lives can be cut off from the source of life. Now, if anything is clear from this little story that Jesus tells of a vineyard owner and a barren tree and the gardener, if anything is clear, it's this. That fig tree, barren, that's not the way God meant it to be. And that's not the kind of life God wants for any human being, for any one of us. There's a 2nd century saint and theologian and bishop named Irenaeus. And he said quite famously, the glory of God is the human being fully alive. The glory of God is the human being fully alive, and then the life of the human being is the vision of God. Irenaeus knew what God wants for human lives is for full, flourishing lives. And the way we come to that kind of life is to find ourselves connected to the vision of God, our very source of life. That Quaker, Thomas Kelly, in the midst of that downward spiral, somehow came to a transformation in his life. It's never really clear exactly what happened, but every one of his friends testified to the dramatic change his life underwent. And he obliquely refers to this transformation in some of his essays. He says that he fell so far, he fell into the hands of the living God. And then he says, and these are his words, that his life was uprooted. His life was uprooted from earthbound securities and assurances. Friends, that hurts when that happens. He was feeling the pain. A life uprooted from earthbound securities and assurances, and it's exactly what we all need. And when his life was uprooted, somehow he found it transplanted into the very love of God. Kelly died when he was 48 years old, and he had this experience of transformation when he was 45. And for those last 3 years, he flourished. He was free of his restlessness, free of his ambition. For 3 years, he lived that fully alive life. Fully alive. It's what Jesus called abundant life. And it's what God wants for each one of us and for his church. Now, if you put this accent in the wrong place, this little story could be a parable of judgment, right? If the accent's on the vineyard owner, cut the tree down! But if you put the story in the context of Jesus' life and ministry where it belongs, then the accent becomes on the gardener's patience and compassion. which is a picture of Jesus' own life and ministry and the way he responded to people. Think about the people Jesus interacted with or talked about. Remember the woman at the well? How she was cut off from the source of life by shame and isolation. Remember the woman caught in adultery? She was cut off from the source of life by her own sin and by the judgment of others. Remember the story of the prodigal son, how he was cut off from that source of life by his own greed and the dishonor of his family. Remember his older brother, how he was cut off from the source of life by his anger and his envy. Remember Zacchaeus, that wee little man, how he was cut off from the source of life by his greed and corruption. And in the story just after this one in the Gospel of Luke, it's about a woman who's been bent over and crippled for 13 years. And she's cut off from the source of life, not just by disease, but by religious bigotry that pushed her out of the community. And in each one of these cases, the message to Jesus and of Jesus and the message to us isn't, I'm going to cut you down. But the message is, you were made for more than this. You were made to flourish. You were made for beauty. You were made for joy. You were made to stand up straight and walk. You were made for fullness of life. You were made to walk this life hand in hand with God. And I've come to bring you life, he says. I have come to nourish your roots. I have come to give you space so you can breathe again. Nourishing our roots. This is the work of God in Jesus. It's the work of God. But it's work with God's help we can cooperate with. It's work with God's help we can respond to. It's work with God's help we can make ourselves available to. So let's take a couple minutes and just think about our own lives. Where, if there is a place, where in your life are you feeling compressed, squeezed, or suffocated? Are you heading towards your own version of the academic trifecta? Is there bitterness or envy or unforgiveness in your life that's keeping your roots from breathing the oxygen of God's love? Are you running so fast on the treadmill of accumulation that you can't catch your breath? If so, the first thing we need to do is simply remember. Remember that Jesus is the gardener, who is patient and who is already at work. He's already at work. We might not feel it, we might not notice it, we might even be actively resisting it, but Jesus the gardener is already at work trying to get through, trying to create space, trying to bring us to life. So if we remember that, then we can respond. We can do something, maybe something very little. We might not be able to make a wholesale change of life all at once, how nice that would be, but we might, with God's help, just be able to wiggle a little bit, to create some space around our roots so that we can become more available and more receptive of God's work in our lives. It might just be simple, little things that create that space. Maybe what you need to do is make a decision this week to forgive someone that you've been harboring a grudge against. That might be just enough to create that space around your roots for God's work. Or maybe what you need to do is send an email or pick up the phone and call a friend or call me or call Ginger or call someone on our staff and just say, look, can we talk? I'm feeling a little suffocated and cut off from God, and I just want to talk through this. And that's a hard call to make because I've made it more than once in my life. But it could be just what you need to do to create that space for the work of God around your roots. Maybe this year it's to take the message of our stewardship campaign more seriously than you have in the past. And to hear anew the truth of the Christian wisdom that enlarging hearts with generosity really is a way to make more room for God in our lives. Maybe that's the decision, to take this more seriously. Or maybe it's this simple, to find 5 minutes of silence this week and sit on the couch with no one around and let that sitting there in silence be your simple prayer. Not even to use words, just let sitting there be your prayer. God, I want to be fully alive. I want there to be space in this life of mine for you. I want to be available for you. Here I am. Whatever it is, there are simple ways perhaps that we can respond. So I'd like us to have a chance right now just to make a concrete decision about one thing we can do in the next 7 days. One thing, simple thing, in the next 7 days that we can do to make ourselves more available to God who wants to nourish and strengthen our roots. In the pew rack in front of you or maybe behind you, there's a card like this that has a tree on it. Grab one of those cards. There should be enough, though you might have to move a couple feet to get to one. And you'll want to grab a pencil, too, or a pen out of the pew rack or out of your neighbor's purse. And we're going to have a chance in just a minute. Notice this card has a very simple question on it. What commitment will I make to allow God to nourish and strengthen my roots this week? Maybe it's one of those things I've listed. Maybe it's that little thing you've been thinking about for the last 20 minutes. Maybe it's something that God will bring to you in a couple minutes of prayer. But what is the one thing, the one little step that you can take this week to create some space in your life for the nurturing, life-giving, gracious, strengthening work of God? I'm going to sit down and Bradley's going to play the piano for just about 2 or 3 minutes to give you some time to think and pray and write something down, and then Ginger will lead us in prayer.